I've often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and Nate. Today, Marlo is out on her honeymoon, and we are joined by my new co-host, Nate Hochman, who is an ISI Journalism Fellow at National Review, and our special guest, Yoram Hazony. Yoram is the chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation and the author of the forthcoming book with Regnery Publishing, Conservatism, A Rediscovery. Yoram, Nate, welcome to the show.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm glad to be here.
Our listener question of the week comes from Julia, who wants to know, from both a historical and contemporary perspective, what are the similarities and differences between American conservatism and European conservatism? Is there hope for a transatlantic alliance today?
Well, I think that obviously conservatism is not a universal theory like liberalism and Marxism. Liberals and Marxists tend to think that they have the right answers for how everybody should live every place in the world and at every moment in history. And conservatives are quite a bit more practical about things and see each country as having its own unique traditions. So it's not surprising that there will be differences from one nation to the next. You can't expect a Russian conservatism or a Chinese conservatism to be the same as Anglo-American conservatism. So there are obviously differences, but I think in general, the discourse in the last few decades has exaggerated the differences between American and European conservatism. And at this point, we're watching a convergence in which nationalist conservatives in America and nationalist conservatives in Europe are coming to be quite a bit, I think, more and more similar to one another because they're facing many of the same issues.
That's interesting. I remember doing a fellows program, which I won't mention which one. I enjoyed the program very much, but I was engaged in a discussion with one of the professors, and they were insisting that America was the first just regime in the history of mankind, because it was the only regime based on the consent of the governed. And I just, said to myself, I understand, I get where you're coming from, but that can't possibly be true.
I have certain guesses about what fellowship program that is based on the particular political philosophy.
And I love the program, I'll say that. But your perspective, Yoram, is refreshing. I'm sure we'll unpack that in a little bit more. So thanks for the question, Julia. And to our listeners, if you'd like to submit a question for the next episode, please leave a review of the show wherever you're listening and put a question in that review, or DM us on social media. You can find us on all platforms at ISI.
So moving on to our books of the week, Yoram, what are you reading right now?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say that the last couple of weeks, I've been doing almost nothing but organizing the National Conservatism Conference. So I actually have not done much reading. But before that, I was reading Christopher Caldwell's remarkable and crucial book, The Age of Entitlement, which looks at what he says was a shift to a new constitutional regime after the Second World War, especially beginning in the 1960s in the United States. That sounds exaggerated, but I think his case is really compelling that by the 1960s, the United States had established what we can call like an Enlightenment liberalism, a regime of Enlightenment liberalism in place of more traditional Christian American governmental forms. And everybody should read the book.
Nate, how about you? What are you reading?
So we wouldn't be a very good podcast if we didn't plug our guests' books. And I whipped back out rereading Yoram's Virtue of Nationalism, which is just a fantastic book. I recommend it to everyone. I assume a decent amount of our listeners have read it before or are at least familiar with it. But it's one of the most important critiques of liberal internationalism that I think has come out in the last decade. And particularly for the subject that we're discussing today, in terms of the National Conservative Conference, I think it's a really, really timely book discussing issues like the realignment, the nationalist resurgence across the West, understanding where we went wrong in terms of this kind of liberal cosmopolitan consensus of the last 3 decades. It's a fantastic book.
And I should mention that it did win ISI's Conservative Book of the Year award. So it was an honor to have that book on our list. And we'll actually be announcing the finalists for this year's Conservative Book of the Year award next week. Before we continue with the interview, I'd like to thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So Yoram, you just finished hosting a major conference in Orlando called the National Conservatism Conference. In a few words, could you describe what is national conservatism and what were some of the highlights or surprises from your recent event?
Well, I think most national conservatives actually think that what we're calling national conservatism just is conservatism. I mean, most of them see it as the continuation of the Anglo-American conservative tradition, which has always been inherently nationalist to one degree or another. But I think that over the last, especially in the last generation, since Margaret Thatcher was deposed in 1990 for being too nationalist and for standing in the way of European Union, and especially since the Bush administration declared a New World Order in 2001, a project that involved creating a single law of international liberalism and imposing it on the entire planet. Since those events, there have been a lot of people who've been called conservatives, even though they are fundamentally their worldview is liberal internationalism. And so we've been adding the word national in national conservative in order to make it clear who and what it is that we're standing against. In our generation, conservatism is standing against liberal internationalism, even though it's embraced by various people who say they're conservatives. That's on the one side. On the other side, of course, we also see national conservatism as a crucial alternative to theories of white identitarianism, which have been getting stronger on the far right in the United States and also in Europe.
Yoram, a quick follow-up question. So I could see sort of the vision that you sketched, a national conservatism that believes in sovereignty and an individual nation's right to self-determination, to act within their own traditions. I could see that being relatively compatible with a Reagan or a Thatcher, the vision that they had for conservatism in their respective countries at the time. I guess my question, in something that you've developed in other essays, one in particular, The American Conservative, is you were making the case for the federalist tradition in American politics, going back to Alexander Hamilton and Adams, and as opposed to maybe the Jeffersonian tradition. And so to what extent is national conservatism perhaps more than just a belief in sovereignty and nations governing according to their own rules, and sort of an explicit preference for a Hamiltonian vision as opposed to maybe more of a libertarian kind of approach?
Well, I think it's a key question. I mean, there's at last week's National Conservatism Conference, there was a crucial speech by Patrick Deneen, who argued, I believe correctly, that that with the establishment of liberalism as kind of a hegemonic worldview after World War II, there, as part of that, there has been a distortion of the American founding, which kind of reaches back to the American founding and sees it as this kind of pure Enlightenment, liberal founding, unique in history, something that had never existed before, something like what we were discussing a little before, and I I agree with Patrick that this view is simply false. I mean, there certainly was a liberal rationalist impulse in the American founding. It was personified, most obviously in Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine. But the part of the story that my co-author Ivry and I were emphasizing in that American conservative essay is the fact that the American founding is actually has two moments. I mean, it has the influence of Jefferson and Paine, which was kind of at its maximum at the moment of the Declaration of Independence. But by the time the Americans had experienced 10 years of chaos and avoided military defeat and the dismantling of the new republic, they avoided only because all sorts of private individuals stepped forward to write checks in order to be able to move armies, and because the French intervened. I mean, the whole American Revolution was, people don't usually emphasize this, but it was touch and go the entire time. And what became the Federalist Party, which is the name that the American Nationalist Conservative Party took in the early 1780s. What became the Federalist Party was a reaction against the vision of sort of every individual for himself, the best government is no government, which was the legacy of Jefferson and Paine. Who were these people? The Federalists were first and foremost George Washington, without whom the national Constitution simply wouldn't have come into being, and his closest Federalist collaborators were Alexander Hamilton. John Jay is especially important. Gouverneur Morris is especially important. He was the principal drafter. A great conservative and nationalist. He was the principal drafter of the Constitution, and of course John Adams, who wrote, this 3-volume work in defense of the constitutions of the United States, which is this classic work of national conservatism. So that group of 5 men and their colleagues, when you take a look at what they were after modeling the American Constitution as much as possible on the English tradition, and that is in most respects what in fact happened. They were much more serious about public Christianity than say Jefferson and Paine, and their party stood for the continuation of the English common law into the American national legal tradition. So they saw the Americans as continuing the English nation, and in terms of law, in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of religion, and their party, really did found the United States as we know it. I think that they are, in fact, the best model for thinking about national conservatism in the United States.
On the question of a distinctly American nationalist tradition, we spoke earlier in the podcast about the differences and potential similarities between a European conservatism and an American conservatism. Yoram, you and I have discussed in previous conversations where we think there are similarities and differences in the broader nationalist revival that's happening across the West, but there are also important differences, right? Nationalism is explicitly and inherently rooted in the specific traditions and folkways and customs of a particular way of life distinct to a particular people. America is distinct from European countries in a lot of ways, but most specifically in terms of the fact that we had a founding. So how do you think a national conservatism in America, a sort of authentically American national conservatism is different from and distinct from the various nationalist revivals in the rest of the Western world?
Well, look, I do agree with you that there are important differences, but I think I hesitate to accept your formulation just because the Dutch Republic certainly had something that looks an awful lot like a founding. And if you read the Dutch Declaration of Independence from 1581, you will see that their Protestant nationalism looks extremely similar to America's Protestant nationalism, which became independent two centuries later. But they all knew the Dutch Declaration, and earlier than that, I mean, I also think that there are strong parallels to Henry VIII's political establishment of England, or reestablishment, let's say restoration of England as an independent country in the 1530s. People emphasized the independence of the Anglican Church from Rome. That's of course part of it, but the move is a move to explicitly declare English law, meaning the common law and English Parliament, sovereign in Britain, and it is a declaration of independence. I mean, England had been independent before, but the American founding is very similar to those two Protestant Christian foundings.
Yoram, there's a growing coalition of people who are unwoke, right? Who have either rejected or defected from the trend towards identity politics, critical theory that's consuming most American institutions. Many of these people are classical liberals, and some of them you invited to speak at your conference a couple weeks ago. I'm curious, from your perspective, what role do you see classical liberals and even left liberals who are dissenting from the zeitgeist as part of this national conservative coalition?
That's a terrific question. Look, when we did the first national conservatism conferences before 2020, in 2019, we kind of, our job in retrospect was reasonably simple. We were facing, primarily a dominant hegemonic liberal internationalism in both America and Europe. And the job of national conservatism was to challenge that hegemonic liberalism. But to our amazement, 2020, which I believe is going to be seen as a watershed year in the history of America and the democratic nations. 2020 brought us, first of all, face to face with the reality of an aggressive rising China, of great power and great ambition, much more so than I think most Americans and Europeans had understood before. And at the same time, we have this absolutely astonishing phenomenon of the lightning fast rise of a neo-Marxist ideology. You can call it progressive, you can call it woke, which over the course of 2020 established its dominance in most, maybe close to all of the major liberal institutions in the United States, and lots of institutions in Britain and in other countries. To the extent that you can be reading scientific magazines like Nature or Scientific American or great liberal universities like Princeton, or great newspapers, great liberal papers like the New York Times, which over the course of a year spun around and pledged allegiance to this new woke movement. partly I'm sure it's out of true belief, and partly just to keep from getting swept away. So the conditions in 2021 are dramatically different. I mean, we're still facing, sort of the vestiges of liberal internationalism, except that all of the institutions that were liberal internationalists are now some flavor of or another of cultural revolutionaries proceeding on the basis of these radical theories of race and gender and so forth. So when we look at this situation, suddenly national conservatives have to deal also with what you're talking about, which is liberal anti-Marxists, liberals who do not see themselves as conservatives, but are refugees in a sense. They're the small number of liberals, but many of them are really brilliant people and influential, who want to resist the Cultural Revolution. And I think it's inevitable that more and more of them are going to turn to national conservatives as allies, because there aren't enough of them to win this by themselves. I mean, it's good and it's encouraging that that anti-Marxist liberals are active in doing things like founding the new University of Austin, and I'm completely supportive of these kinds of anti-Marxist liberal efforts. But the reality is that their numbers are not going to be sufficient, and the really big reservoir of anti-Marxist sentiment in America and in other democratic nations is in the zone that we've been calling national conservative. They're going to have to find a way to work with us, and we're going to have to find a way to work with them. I mean, I just don't think we're going to win this alone. And so that's why the National Conservatism Conference, in addition to having a majority of NatCons, had a number of marvelous liberal, anti-Marxist liberal figures like Dave Rubin and Glenn Lowry, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Douglas Murray, and others.
I do think the revolutionary conditions of the moment we're in that you're describing also goes a long way to describe why there's so much young people's interests in national conservatism. I mean, I was struck, I wasn't at 2019, but speaking as a young person, I was struck at how many people my age were at national conservatism. And it won't be, I think, a surprise to either of you guys to hear that young conservatives in particular are much more attracted to this brand of conservatism, this sort of renewed nationalism, than I think a lot of older folks are. And in many ways, a lot of the ideological divides on the right, not all of them, but a lot of them can be mapped onto generational divides. And for me, as someone who came to be interested in this style of conservatism after I think a lot of other people, relatively late, 2020 and the experience of 2020 directly sort of interfacing with the radicalism of what you call a neo-Marxist revolution was what made me convinced that the old way of thinking about conservatism, the old frameworks and language offered by Reagan-era conservatism, was insufficient to meet the needs of the moment. I'm curious, do you think that's a fair characterization of why young people are attracted to national conservatism? Why do you think that the ideological divides on the right seem to map more or less onto some amount of generational tension as well?
I think your description is right on. I'll just add that the phenomenon of young people being attracted to being more open to new ways of thinking, I think that's that's part of the way that's part of human nature. This is part of the way that human societies renew themselves, is that most, not all, but most older people tend to be resistant to giving up their old ways of thinking, even when the facts are crying out for a rethinking. And younger people are just much better than older people at taking in the new information and doing something with it. I think that our I mean, I hope that young people will have the patience to build up an alliance with us older national conservatives, because there are great resources in the earlier conservative tradition. I mean, going back centuries and centuries, but even if we're talking about the last few generations worth of conservatives, there is a tendency among young people on the right to kind of say, well, look, I'm under 40, so I'm the only one who gets it. And that's not very conservative. And I don't think it's going to lead to the wisest and best outcomes. I think the wisest and best outcomes you get when younger people say, all right, I'm not with the I'm not with the old guard that seems to be just completely resistant to the facts, but there are. I'm sorry for plugging myself, but I and my colleagues have been on the national conservative side, many of us, our whole lives. And in my new book, Conservatism: A Rediscovery, I actually have a chapter about how my wife and I and our friends became national conservatives at college as part of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. People today, there's been this distortion as though Reagan and Thatcher were just liberals, just free market liberals and libertarians. There's an element of truth to that, but not enough. And Reagan was also a nationalist. He was known as a nationalist. He was described as a nationalist at the time. He did not believe in imposing a new world order of American rule around the planet. He did not invade any countries, unless you count Grenada, which was a 2-week operation. But he didn't invade any countries on the other side of the planet in order to occupy them for decades. And more generally, there were important national conservative thinkers in the 1980s. If you read George Will's Statecraft is Soulcraft, well, I mean, that is nothing like George Will today, but that is a serious national conservative manifesto of the kind that I think young people who are trying to deal with reality today, wow, they should be reading that. Or Irving Kristol's Reflections of a Neoconservative. I know the word neoconservative today is seen as just anathema, but the word in its original meaning meant nothing like what it means today. In fact, it meant almost the opposite of what it means today. And so, if you want a brilliant writer arguing for nationalism and giving only 2 cheers for capitalism, and seeing that the market has to have its limits, and that it's the job of the state to and representative government to find those limits, and arguing for a religious public culture, then it's not just Jerry Falwell and Billy Graham, who were Reagan allies, who argued for those things. Even Irving Kristol is full-throated in his arguments for that kind of national conservatism. So I think we have a lot more resources that in our tradition that younger people, I hope, will be patient enough to look them up. And that's even before we start talking about serious conservatives like Russell Kirk or Robert Nesbitt. I mean, there's a lot, and it's much better to be reading and thinking than to be trying to come up with it all yourself.
Yeah, I get a lot of flack sometimes from some of my young new right, for lack of a better word, friends online for pointing out that Irving Kristol was remarkably conservative. But he was the one who wrote one of the most famous essays in American conservatism in favor of censorship, in favor of banning pornography. And I think in many ways, I see the National Conservative Project as a renewal of a richer, older style of American conservatism that has always been around, but has been sort of lost in the last couple of decades, rather than a departure from conservatism, which is, I think, what it gets accused of. But Yoram, it's moving on, I think, to some substantive policy questions. It's easy to imagine a Republican candidate adopting some talking points from national conservatives, but harder to imagine a national conservative agenda getting implemented in practice due to resistance from both members of Congress and other Beltway conservative groups committed to the sort of older style of Reaganite 1980s style politics. What policy victories do you think would be easiest to implement with a new administration, and where do you foresee challenges?
I think that's a very well framed question. I mean, one of the great talks from the National Conservatism Conference was Rod Dreher, who spent the last few months in Hungary, and he was basically reporting back on Hungary has had a national conservative government for the better part of a decade, and the Hungarians have been implementing all sorts of. I don't know if they're exactly the things that American NatCons would want to implement, but certainly a lot of things having to do with family policy and opposing flooding the country with immigrants from the Middle East, even though the Germans really want Hungary to be flooded with immigrants. So on immigration, family policy, the positioning of the church as part of the public culture, and numerous other issues. The Hungarians are an interesting model to look at, and Rod emphasized, and I think this is very important, that the Hungarians have not been imposing, just whatever they thought was important or whatever they thought was just. Part of their strategy is to choose those parts of the national conservative agenda which are supported by a majority of Hungarians. Most Hungarians are very far from having settled national conservative views, and it's important when you're talking about practical politics to be looking not just at what we ought to do in some ideal world, but what will the public support us doing. And so obviously a really good example right now is Christopher Rufo, who is an important thinker and activist in this movement. He's been the spearheading the effort to get state governments involved in legislating in order to restrict the advance of the neo-Marxist cultural agenda in the schools. And we run into lots of the older generation of liberal internationalists who call themselves conservatives, who they just have a horror of doing anything that involves legislating for the public good. By the way, the term "the common good" I think is a perfectly good term. I do use it, but many conservatives use the national interest or the public interest. All of these terms mean the same thing. They mean that it's the responsibility of government, of every government, to intervene when there are manifest and obvious dangers to the well-being of the nation. And it is beyond bizarre that that politicians like Reagan and Thatcher, who would have signed on what I just said in a second, are being taken as models for the removal of government from every possible sphere of activity.
To jump in here, I want to pull out some threads from your speech at the National Conservatism Conference, because I think what you're describing, let's say you get your ideal president takes the helm in 2025. Some of the things you mentioned, immigration, I could see most DC conservative organizations getting on board with securing the southern border. But I think some of these other ideas, family policy, maybe in the industrial policy that you might see someone like David Goldman advocate for. I think there would be pushback very specifically because within the fusionist framework, which I want to have you unpack a little bit because I know you offered a critique of it. The end of government is freedom. The end of the individual and the community is virtue. And so anything that is not freedom, which basically translates to anything that's not a tax cut, a deregulation, or privatization or increase of choice, is not allowed. And so basically every constellation, most conservative institutions exist to manifest those realities in various different spheres of life. So there's really not even the shop built out at many of these think tanks to propose and implement some of the ideas that you have. So, I mean, do you think, I think there is there are new institutions or new magazines, new publications. There's more people now that could probably implement your agenda than 4 years ago or 5 years ago when Trump took office. But maybe can you unpack, is that fusionist understanding that I described, consistent with the American tradition, with the conservative tradition? And do you see there being any hope for a modification of that? Because there is something healthy about preserving freedom, but not quite maybe in the dichotomy that it's presented.
Well, sure. I mean, the freedom of speech and free exercise of religion are, they're important. They're important. They're crucial parts of the Anglo-American political tradition. And neither I nor my colleagues have an interest in taking an axe to these important traditions, which create a society that we all value and cherish. But as you're suggesting, most of us do think that there was a wrong turn in American conservatism in the 1960s. Now, let me rush to say that this fusionism, which was the architects were Bill Buckley and especially Frank Meyer, and what they did was what they were fusing their own individualism. Buckley's first book, he called himself an individualist, not a conservative. And basically what they were doing is fusing their own individualism or liberalism. You can call it classical liberalism or libertarianism. All these words are appropriate to a certain degree. They were taking their individualism and fusing it with the traditionalism, which is to say the conservatism of somebody like Russell Kirk. And the reason that they found themselves on the same team, even though Kirk at one point said that trying to bring libertarians and conservatives into the same alliance is like trying to fuse fire and ice. And I think there's some truth to that. The reason they were able to do it was because they were facing, this was after Sputnik, and they were facing a serious threat from communist Russia and the communist world abroad, and at home they were facing this sort of tidal wave of social planning, of economic planning, which was coming out of the theory that if the only way to rationally maximize the productivity of an economy is for bureaucrats to sit somewhere and make all the decisions about how the entire economy of the country is going to be run. It's something just utterly crazy, and yet that was a majority opinion in the United States and Britain at the time. And so what happened was that Buckley and Meyer proposed to Kirk and his colleagues a fusion. They worked together. That was a great success in a lot of ways. That fusion is what defeated the Soviet Union. That fusion is what rolled back socialism. So, there clearly were good things about it. But the structure, and I think this is really the most important point for young people today to understand, the structure of fusionist conservatism was from the start a fusion of a public liberalism or libertarianism, a public emphasis on freedom any way that you can get it in any sphere, almost. A public liberalism with a private conservatism, like you said earlier, Johnny. And that has failed us. I mean, the theory was that it was possible to be, a liberal in your public and political life, but at home you would teach, whatever it was, Catholicism or evangelicism or Orthodox Judaism, and in private you'd be able to maintain the nationalist and religious traditions and moral traditions of the country. But that turned out to be completely false. I mean, it's just utterly untrue. When you ban the Bible and school prayer, when you ban it, what you're creating is when you ban it from the schools, you are creating a factory for the production of liberals. And those liberals don't have a sentimental attachment to nationalism or to Christianity or to Judaism or to the Bible. You go 1-2 generations forward, and there's nothing left at all. Almost everywhere what you're seeing is devastation. And so, at this point, when people say, what has the conservative movement conserved lately, that question really has to be well taken. Because if your worldview is a public liberalism, that the point of government is to secure individual liberties, full stop, period, and nothing else, if that's your worldview, then you are not going to end up with traditionalists of any kind, not traditionalist Christians and not traditionalist Jews. And so what I proposed at this conference, and it seems to me that there are some important takers, we'll see, is a new kind of well, first of all, I called it diffusion. The first thing we have to do is to understand that liberalism just isn't conservatism. It never was. And if you think that liberalism in America is conservatism, then you just don't know enough history, and you got to learn something about it. Liberalism is not conservatism. So that's the first step that everyone has to take right now, just so we can think clearly. And then the second step, once you can take that, is to recognize that liberalism cannot transmit things from one generation to the next. Only conservatism, only traditionalism is capable of that. So if you want anything to survive of what you believe into future generations, into your posterity, as the American Constitution wanted, then you have to ask what is sustainable. And asking what is sustainable brings you into the world, takes you out of liberal thought and into the world of conservative thought. And what I see going forward is going to be a revival, a renewal, restoration of Anglo-American conservatism, in which the public sphere will be, wherever at least there's a majority that will support this, the public sphere will be traditionalist. It will be, in most places where there's a Christian majority, it'll be Christian. And the way that we continue the tradition of, caring about individual liberties is going to be with carve-outs for minorities, for religious minorities, for national minorities, for people whose lifestyle isn't the kind of lifestyle that conforms with a Christian public morality. But I think that what we're going to have to do is to learn to give appropriate carve-outs to most or all of these minority groups in order to be able to bring them into both into a political coalition and also, just to allow them a decent life.
Yoram, on that note, we'll conclude our conversation, but thank you so much for joining us. If people are interested in seeing more of your work or following you, where can they find you?
They can go to nationalconservatism.org, which is the clearinghouse site. You can find, all of the videos from the conferences, and it's constantly updated with new books and essays that are national conservatism friendly. And if you're interested, you can also go to yoramhazony.org.
Awesome. Thanks again for joining us, Yoram, and thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.